For functions to be useful, they generally have two options. The first is they can modify the state of the program, as the examples we've seen so far. Printing to the output is modifying the state, as we're changing what appears in the console. The drawBar function we wrote modified the state of the program by drawing rectangles in the graphics window. The other option is to have the function return a value. This is the same idea as mathematical functions that take one or more values and produce a new value. For example, we could write f of x equals x squared using our standard mathematical notation. We are passing the function f a parameter x, and it is returning the value it calculates. When writing computer programs, it is much more common for functions to return a value than print something. Here is an example Python program with two functions that return values. The square function shows that the Python keyword return is used to send information back to the caller. We use parameters to send information to a function, and use a return statement to send information back. In the distance function we call the square function. The first call sends the difference in the x coordinates. The square function receives this information as the parameter x, and calculates the square of x and returns it. The result that is sent back is assigned to dx squared. We repeat the process with the difference in the y values. The distance function now completes the calculation and sends the distance between the 2 points that were passed to it back to where it was called. We can see on line 18 that we stored the result in the variable d and then displayed it in a text object. Let's run it and see that it works. We now can understand that the getX and getY methods in the point class return the coordinate, and the GraphWinds getMouse method returns the point where you click. Generally, you don't want to ignore the return value of functions and methods. One exception we've seen is that when we don't care where the user clicks to close the window, we ignore the return value of the getMouse method. But if we just called the square function and didn't use its return value, we would not have accomplished anything. Also note that if we replace the return statement in the square function with the call to the print function, our program does not work. Let's run it and see what happens with this change. After clicking the mouse twice, it crashes, stating that we tried to add two values of type none. Let's debug it this time. And after our 2 clicks, we can see that it crashed at line 10 as before, but this time we can see the values of dx squared and dy squared are the constant none. None is a special constant in Python that indicates no value. Every Python function returns some value. If you do not explicitly put a return statement and return an expression, it returns none. It is as if we had written return none after the print statement. This also shows you why we usually don't have print statements in most functions. In this case, we're using the result of the square function as part of a more complex calculation to determine the distance between the 2 points. We don't want to see the result of the square function printed to the console, as it's not important to us. All we want to do is use that result as part of the distance calculation. Since most functions are used as part of a more complex calculation, most functions return a value so the code that calls it can determine whether it wants to output that value or use it as part of a more complex calculation. Most functions also do not have input statements in them, because that would require the execution of the function to pause execution and wait for the user to enter a value. Instead, if a function needs data to perform its operations, it takes parameters that the caller of the function must send to it. Since the program crashed, we'll use the option to stop it. Let's see how the inspect option would help us find this error before running it. I'll press Shift Option I, and it shows the 2 warnings stating that the square function doesn't return anything. Let's fix the code so it's correct again. Let's debug it by setting a breakpoint on the call to the distance function. We'll use the option to step into it. Now we'll try to step into the square function. What it actually did is step into the getX call, so we'll step out of that one. As you might guess, when we call step into again, it will step into the second getX call, so we'll do that and step out of it. Now we can step in again and see that it sent the difference between the 2 x coordinates as the parameter x to the square function. The frames view shows us how we got to this line in the execution of our programs and where it will go back to. We'll step out and press step over to complete the first call to the square function, and now we can see the value of dx squared. This time we'll use step over, and it steps over all the function calls on line 9 and assigns the value to dy squared. We can now step out of the distance function and see that it went back to the main function. We can press step over to complete the call, and the variable d now holds the distance between the 2 points. If we press resume, it will wait for a mouse click and then complete the program. Let's make one other common mistake and add a print statement after the return statement in the distance function. If we run it and click twice, we notice there is no output. Let's use the inspect option again, and it shows the print statement is unreachable. Once a function executes a return statement, no code after that in the function is executed. So while this print statement does not make the program invalid, it is never executed, so it does not accomplish anything. This means a return statement is usually the last statement in a function. Once we learn the if statement, we'll see that there are times when the return statement is not the last statement of a function. Let's look at a slightly modified version of the same program. In this version, we didn't store the results of the square function in the variables dx squared and dy squared. Instead, we immediately used the results as the left and right operands of the plus operator. This shows that you do not need to assign the return value of a function to a variable, but if you don't assign it to a variable, you should use it as part of an expression as we did here. Let's now review the details of functions as we've learned in these last few videos. You write a function by putting the keyword def, followed by the name of the function, followed by parentheses with any parameters inside the parentheses, and then a colon after the parentheses. The statements that make up the body of the function are indented one level underneath the def statement. The last statement is usually a return statement. If you do not put a return statement, it is as if you had written return none as the last statement of the function body. You call a function by putting the name of the function, followed by parentheses with the actual parameters inside the parentheses. The number of formal parameters and actual parameters must match up, and the order they are written is how they are assigned. Whether or not the names match does not matter at all. When a function is called, the Python interpreter completes 4 steps to execute the function. First, it pauses execution at the function call. Second, it assigns each formal parameter to its corresponding actual parameter. Next, it executes the body of the function. And lastly, it returns from the function and resumes execution where the function was called. As we saw, we can write code that stores the return value in a variable, or we can use the return value as part of a more complex calculation. If a function does not return a value, it automatically returns none, in which case you should not do anything with the return value. We don't want to assign a value to the chorus function that simply output the lyrics to the chorus. It did not have a return statement, so it automatically returned none. We call the chorus function without assigning a value to it, since it does not have a return statement.